Welcome to the second session of our webinar series on environmental and social licensing and enforcement during the COVID-19 crisis. Before I continue, please note that simultaneous interpretation is available by clicking on the globe icon in the bar at the bottom of the screen and selecting English or Spanish. Antes que todo, les indico que tenemos interpretación en la barra inferior de la pantalla.
Before I continue, please note that we have simultaneous interpretation available by clicking on the globe icon in the bar at the bottom of the screen. You can select English or Spanish.
This is the second of our series of a four-part series under the framework of the Regional Policy Dialogue on Environmental Licensing and Enforcement in Latin America and the Caribbean. My name is Davis Jones, and I am the coordinator of the network, and I work in the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit at the Inter-American Development Bank. If I can take the advantage of this opportunity to greet the members of both the international and the Latin American networks on environmental compliance and enforcement, INES and Red La FICA, respectively, which are well represented today by our speakers. I also wish to thank our speakers and all of the attendees for making room in your busy days to help share experiences as we all work to improve our programs. During the second session of our series, we will focus on mechanisms being implemented by different countries to monitor social and environmental compliance while maintaining social distancing required under the COVID-19 pandemic. But first, I would like to clarify some language. And so we're going to play a little exercise. If you would go to menti.com and please type in the code 328086. That's www.menti.com and use the code 328086. You can see it at the top of the terminology. What do you call, what term do you use to if you can just enter one code or one word into your screen? I'll pause for a minute while people enter. As you can tell, there's a lot, besides the language, there are lots of different words we use to discuss the same function. And as these word clouds work, the larger the word corresponds to more people writing it in. All right, let's move to the second question. How often do inspectors, or whatever you call them, in your agency go out into the field? As regularly as always, no changes? Less frequently, but they still conduct inspections? They only go out for emergencies, or they never go out? Not at all. I'm interested by the variety of answers. I think that speaks to our differences in our programs and how we address our functions during this pandemic. All right, to move on, a couple of logistical issues. Our four panelists and their institutions are very experienced in addressing these exact questions. So we should have some enlightened discussions about the challenges and solutions that are being implemented. Each panelist will have no more than 15 minutes for your presentation. Please allow time at the end for your questions. If you would, use the Zoom's chat feature for your questions rather than the question and answer button. That way we can capture all questions and we'll respond to as many as we can at the end of the presentations. And those that we can address, we'll answer later and post on the website. So now let me introduce Christian Perez, an external consultant for the Inter-American Development Bank, who will moderate the rest of the session.
Muchas gracias, Davis.
Thank you very much, Davis. It is also a pleasure for me to welcome you all to the second virtual session of this regional public dialogue during this COVID-19 pandemic. Now, I would like to reiterate what Davis Jones has just said regarding the mechanism used for sending in your questions. We ask you to please use the chat as you send in your questions. Also, we ask you to be very specific and to the point in your questions, seeing as we're using this virtual platform. Secondly, I would like to perhaps talk to you about the format for this meeting. We are going to have Joseph Milewski, who's going to open this webinar, who is the Chief of the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit at the IDB. He's going to set the stage for this conversation. And following Joseph's opening remarks, we're going to get 4 presenters who will take the floor. We have with us Tessie Torres, who's the president of the Environmental Assessment and Enforcement Agency in Peru, Rodrigo Suarez, the Director of National Environmental Licensing Authority in Colombia, then Stephen Collins, who is the Lead Sector Specialist, Environmental and Social Solutions Unit at the IDB. And we're going to close with Erica Kensler, who is the Director of the NEIC, or the National Enforcement Investigation Center at the EPA in the United States. Now that this is all clear, and once again, we'd like to reiterate that we have 15 minutes allotted to each of the presenters. We ask you to please use the chat to send in your questions, and at the end of each presentation, we will take some time to answer questions. And so let me now turn the floor to Joseph Milewski. But let me say very quickly that he is the Chief of the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit at the IDB. He has been a safeguarding specialist at the IDB and has led teams in Peru, Brazil, and Guatemala and Argentina, overseeing fishing, tourist, and environmental programs. Before joining the IDB, Joseph worked in the private sector, in the paper industry, and also on human ecology in Canada, impact and assessment. And Joseph has a master's in urban development from the Bachelor University. So, Joseph, I now turn the cyberspace over to you. Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Christian. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to all of our panelists. Thank you all for being here. It is truly a pleasure to be with you all once again. I wish to extend a warm welcome to you all to this second virtual session of the Regional Public Dialogue on Environmental Licensing and Enforcement during COVID-19 pandemic. As Christian said just a few minutes ago, I am the Chief of the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit, which focuses on ensuring that projects funded by the bank are in line with our environmental and social policies, and also assesses the risks of projects funded by the bank. We support the different teams of the IDB, to the executing agencies, and to the environmental and social agencies throughout the region. For those of you who weren't able to join us last week, I would like to very quickly remind everyone of what the goal of these dialogues is. The main goal is to create a platform for dialogue so that different government agencies in Latin America and the Caribbean can share challenges, experiences, and lessons learned in licensing and enforcing environmental and social policies. This webinar series focuses on the challenges that have to do with licensing and enforcing processes during this pandemic, something that has not really happened to this degree for a century. Last week, we had a very interesting session where we were talking about engaging stakeholders virtually with mechanisms to address better engagement and how to address the need as well for more physical needs in the context of this pandemic from coronavirus. Today, we're going to hear about how we can monitor and enforce compliance, focusing on environmental and social issues in time of COVID and looking at these different activities when, with this crisis, we're limited in what we can physically do. On June 11th, in 1 week, we're going to have our next webinar, and we're going to discuss discretional licensing and enforcement during crisis, as well as how authorities provide flexibility to comply with its mandate at this time. The following session on June 25th will have an opportunity to dive deeper into this environmental and social governance mechanisms. And we will also learn about the changes that have come from the COVID-19 pandemic. This session will have limited participation from different agencies that work on environmental and social issues, as well as the experts in the field. At the last session, date to be determined, we're going to talk to Indigenous communities about engagement with those communities during this pandemic. There are some unique challenges that those communities face. For example, when they have to come in contact with somebody who is from outside of their community, they need to be part of the decision-making processes for environmental and social issues that affect them. A lot of governmental, non-governmental organizations carry out activities that have to do with different jurisdictions and programs, and also sometimes operate in public policy fields. There are different activities like auditing and sampling, monitoring, and inspections and enforcing. And even though sometimes the terminology can vary, the function is the same. It ensures that there is compliance with the legal and regulatory frameworks and mechanisms to ensure that there is a lesser impact on the environment and on our communities. This means that we are part of a chain for environmental and social protection. This takes into account the legal mechanisms or risk reduction policies, implementation status, and ensuring compliance with these obligations and commitments, and corrective measures are all part of the activities that we conduct. In this time of pandemic, economies and projects continue moving forward, even though they have slowed down. However, risks continue to grow and to be there. And in some cases, they are being exacerbated. Today, we're talking about the challenges in monitoring compliance in a context of lockdown and limited movement without on-site presence of inspectors as we observe social distancing. And so I invite you all to listen and to share experiences, technologies, and the different methodologies you have developed in Latin America and the Caribbean so that we can all improve and better tailor our practices. So with that, thank you all. Christian, I give the floor back to you. Thank you very much, Joseph. I believe that you have truly set the stage for this conversation. We hope it is going to be a fruitful one today. Now, following the structure that we have here, let me now welcome Tessie Torres, who is the president of the OEFA, the Environmental Assessment and Enforcement Agency in Peru. Tessie works on what she calls the enforcement exercise. She has held important positions as a supervising manager at the enforcement agency and also in the area of protecting intellectual property, has also worked in telecom, and she is a member of the dispute settlement mechanism. She has also been director of enforcement and application of activities at the OEFA, and has degrees from the University in Peru on intellectual property enforcement, consumer protection, administrative processes, and fine calculations. She has a degree from the Catholic University of Peru and has a public policy certification and degree as well from the Ortega Institute. So Tessie, welcome, and now I offer you the cyber floor. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Davis Jones, the IDB, and Christian and Joseph for introducing this topic. I'm going to share my screen now so you can all see my presentation. And it does focus on what is now a challenge for all of those enforcers across these different topics. Now, if you give me 1 second, there we go. All human activity has an impact on the environment, and this is why they need to be monitored around the globe. Activity and based on the magnitude of that impact. During this pandemic, as an enforcement agency, given social distancing measures, we had to suspend some of our enforcement activities. Now, I do need to state that there are still essential parts of our work that needed to continue, as we've seen in other countries. And so despite the fact that these activities, or some of these, were suspended, some of the utilities and solid waste collection and other activities were essential. And this was important for us because that meant that these activities needed for us to also step in and continue to do part of our work. Now, we have had a phased reopening of our economy. We started with phase 0, now we're in 1. This started just a few weeks ago, and so industry, fisheries, and mining industries reopened with specific requirements. And in the second phase, some deliveries for freight and freight transportation will pick up again. And in Peru, there have been activities that have been maintained, which means that enforcement operations needed to continue on that. And we have started to reopen some of the most essential economic activities for the economy of the country, and that is fisheries and mining. And that means that we have had to continue operating as well. Now, we have, of course, continued to address some of the essential business going on, but we have also addressed the emergencies and what had been communicated to us by the public through a claim. In terms of addressing these environmental and social emergencies, our agency has been working throughout this entire period that started in March of this year for us with limited mobility and also observing social distancing. What we have also been able to do fully has been environmental oversight. And so we have a remote capability that allows us to continue to observe that distancing. And so we've been able to continue that activity without having to go physically to these areas. We have also been able to keep all of our staff working remotely. And finally, I wanted to talk to you about the different projects that we've had to face as an enforcement agency in the short, medium, and long term in terms of addressing emergencies. We've seen, and here you have a map of Peru, and the different colors highlight the degree of emergency. We had situations, for example, with hydrocarbon spills or some sort of method of transportation has tipped over, or fires where there is solid waste. Another problem with some burning of crops. For example, there's still sugarcane burning to obtain sugar. And we have also had either a leak or an overspilling of contaminants. And so based on all of these, our supervisors have had to go in person to these places. And so we tried to deploy these officers from the closest office. And the situation that we have not been able to still address the way we'd want to have happened in the jungle with some spills that, given some of the social conflicts, have made it impossible for either the executing agency or for ourselves to go in. And this is made worse by the fact that in this area, there are no infections. None of these indigenous communities have been infected with the coronavirus. And so the concern that this community has is huge. Should there be some representative from the outside coming in with the virus? And so that has made it very difficult to address areas 1, 2, and 3 in the jungle when it comes to these emergencies. And so for the other places, we've tried to dispatch some of the closer officers. We've had 79 different emergencies that we have responded to during this lockdown, and when all movement has been banned, and during the shelter-in-place policies that went into place in March. And so in this scenario, we have been able to do what we saw here. In terms of environmental oversight, that's something that we have been able to continue doing over time. And here it's been important to have these different monitoring networks. The teams and the equipment are installed where you can see here on the map. And so monitoring environmental quality in these areas is something we can do automatically through this equipment and without having to move around. And so this seems to us to be the most fitting tool to use in this new normal. So this is how we have been using our resources for environmental oversight. And so in the areas where we are able to install this equipment, we've had no issues continuing to monitor the quality of the environmental conditions. In terms of the work that our entire team has been doing since 2019, we had some telework capabilities. And so what we have done has been bring all of our staff into the platform. We've made a few adjustments, and the ILO issued some guidelines that we were able to use, and we were able to adjust the system so that we can all continue working remotely and to still have the cooperation tools that were existing then and that we are still developing now, which has made the work that we have done feel more natural. And so that has allowed us to continue working. And so given the work that we have been doing as an agency, we've seen that the targets have changed for what we want to accomplish in our work, and that is because we can no longer go out into the field to do inspections, but our staff is still continuing to work. It's only that they're doing it remotely. So what is a roadmap that we are to follow as an enforcement agency? Well, it is the need to make available to the public more of these tools. And so we've had tools that were available before, but now as an agency, we need to be fully open so that the public can still contact us and work with us. And so with remote oversight, that has been a key tool. That was part of our goal in the medium term, but we've had to speed that process up so that we can fully conduct oversight remotely. And of course, that has been accompanied with updating of our regulations and standards and internal policies. And so we are going to have access for our government agencies that we work with, as well as our administrators and the public very soon. That will be available through a computer or through a smartphone, and will allow someone to look at the different services we provide and request, for example, through filing a claim or through request information on what we are currently doing. All of that is going to be made available. It is currently under review, and we believe that in June it will have been fully rolled out. Here on this platform, we are looking at the different tools that we can use for, once again, filing claims or gaining access to the information. And the virtual emergency reporting tool is already working. Now, there's also the side of the contributions that we get from different companies. Some companies actually have a percentage of their invoicing that comes into our coffers to fund our activities. And so that is also going to be done digitally, and that will allow us to also fully roll out this platform in June 2020. And so all of OEFA services is going to be made available. As I was saying, the need to bolster our remote oversight capabilities was, as I said before, part of our goal, but we want to enforce its preventive actions, because usually when the enforcement officer gets to the site where they are to conduct an inspection, what we want to do here is have more tools. So we need to get more drones. We have a group of drones already. We want to increase that number, improve our technological capabilities, and also have better imaging and sensors for monitoring, say, for example, the quality of water. And so that is a short-term plan that will help us conduct better enforcement remotely. And that means that in this new normality, we won't necessarily have to go out into the field as much, but it will allow us to continue to do that proactive and preventive work. Now here, if I can just share an example, we use satellite imagery, and that will allow us to see what the impact on the environment has been of certain activities with these drone flights and activities. We'll be able to gain access that is somewhat difficult for a person to get to. And this is going to be public access.
Regarding the modifications made to the institutional framework, we were asked through a legislative decree that was conducted through the enactment of a law, and that led to us understanding that in cases where a monetary sanction is deemed appropriate, we have made the decision that during the present time, we will not enforce the payment of said monetary sanction. So there was a communique on the part of OEFA to suspend any collection of monetary sanctions. Now, this does not prohibit us from imposing these sanctions, but we've been able to delay payments for up to 6 months in certain cases involving medium-sized companies, and for smaller companies or businesses, then this could be extended even further. So this was approved based on some new legislation that was recently enacted. And we're also currently looking at this newer version that we're going to be applying to different processes. We're trying to modify our regulatory framework. We also need to be able to provide assurances to all of the companies and businesses that we service that we will be implementing some very rigorous controls to ensure that our personnel will not be exposing themselves to any issues related to exposure. So we're going to be undertaking the necessary protocols such as testing to ensure that they've not been infected by the virus. We're also looking at the various transportation routes and other measures that ensure that the user of our service that will be the subject of a visit by our inspector will not be affected, but also that our personnel will not be exposed to any unnecessary risk in terms of the contagion. That's all I have, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much. Thank you, Desi. first and foremost for your excellent presentation and for adhering to the 15-minute time limitation. Your presentation covered a lot of very interesting topics, and you discussed some of the activities undertaken by OEFA during the pandemic, the various activities that you're engaged in, the newly adopted criteria that you've attached to these activities, some of the modifications and changes that you've made with your workforce and personnel, as well as the roadmap that you've established to face these upcoming challenges, including the development of this user self-service platform and these other tools. So we're very grateful to you for your presentation. And having said that, I'd like to now introduce Rodrigo Suarez Caño. Rodrigo is the Director General of the Environmental Licensing National Authority. He's worked as Director of Climate Change for the Ministry of Development. He's worked for many years in the public sector, and he worked extensively as a project supervisor in various air quality and water quality, as well as other environmental projects. He has extensive experience in various sectors, hydrocarbons, mining, and he's primarily focused on sustainable development work, extending and expanding public participation in these programs. Rodrigo is an environmental engineer, graduate from the La Salle University, as well as a graduate from the Santo Tomas School of Public Administration in the University of the Andes. So I'd like to ask Rodrigo to activate his microphone. Thank you for joining us, Rodrigo.
Perfecto. Muy buenos días.
And a very good morning to all of you, Christian. Cordial greetings for you, as well as Davis, Christopher, Sergio, Monica, and Luis Manuel, who were indispensable in helping me get my connection working. I'd like to ask you to help me with sharing my screen. I'm having some trouble with my computer sharing my screen and by extension sharing my presentation. So I'm wondering if we could get you to help me share my screen, Christian. Thank you. Well, following some of the topics mentioned by Tessie, and the National Colombian Environmental Licensing Authority is part of the Ministry of the Environment and Development. We are the organization that provides oversight for control and follow-up related to projects involved in the hydrocarbon mining infrastructure and energy, as well as agrochemical sectors. And so I'd like to discuss some of the projects that we've been working on. So moving on to the next slide, we primarily focus on two perspectives. One of them has to do, next slide please. It addresses the internal aspects that we focus on in our organization, which is the first thing that we outlined to address the issues related to the lockdown and the stay-at-home orders. This led to some administrative changes, and so we've been trying to engage a great deal with citizens, conducting environmental assessments for licensing purposes, providing follow-up and other activities similar to those described by Tessie. In terms of regulatory work, the agency decided to have personnel work from home. And at present, all of our personnel is working from home with certain exceptions, and those are the folks that are involved in collecting information or documents that are typically submitted in an in-person way, and they're facilitating the digitizing of these documents. So we've created these different channels to expand citizen participation. We've conducted meetings as well as in-person activities, and we had to fortify and strengthen all of these processes that I'll be discussing in greater detail later on. But this was a very important effort because many of the things we used to do in person have now transitioned to the virtual arena. This includes various administrative processes and services, and it includes an internal survey that sought to garner feedback from our employees to improve our working from home methodology. Towards the beginning of this transition, we began to see a certain level of harmony with families, but over time we started to see some changes. Many of the children in the home were not able to go to school, and so we started to identify and observe a changing dynamic within the homes, and this affected the people that we were working with. In terms of customer service, apologies from the interpretation booth. The audio is intermittent. We decided to transition most of our procedural activities to a virtual site. With our email, we had some space limitations because we didn't have capability for getting large documents via email, but this was expanded. In many cases, these reports that are generated related to environmental assessment reports are oftentimes large documents that cannot be emailed, and so we needed to make some changes to our capability to be able to receive these types of documents online. So we subsequently transitioned and imposed the requirement that all documentation needed to be sent in digitized way. We have seen a couple of cases that require some seals of approval from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and other specific items of that nature, but we primarily digitized all of the information that we normally work with. Another thing that I wanted to point out relates to how we've maintained our customer service channels. On the top, you can see here when the quarantine began. And you can see that though the average has maintained a steady pattern, although it has dropped a little bit, we've seen a drop on the order of 26%, 27% of requests made by citizens compared to the prior year. Right now, we've been receiving on the order of 720 requests per day on average. Now, another thing that I wanted to point out is represented here by the blue and red columns. This relates to the activity in our chat stream and our telephone number. And so we can see that the green columns, which represent in-person service interventions, have now been by and large replaced by different types of interventions through the chat stream as well as our telephonic system.
Será 20-30% al 80% como tal. Siguiente, por favor. Y por último, a través, digamos, de plataformas
through
como Zoom o Hangout, pero en la entidad utilizamos
different video conferencing platforms such as Zoom or Hangout and other types of virtual platforms. We've been able to reach out to different stakeholders, and we've conducted different types of meetings. We were averaging about 15 meetings per week.
Se ha reducido un poco
Nevertheless, we've
pero
seen a
digamos que
drop in
se
the
sigue
frequency of
manteniendo
these meetings, but
de
we
atención
have
al usuario. Siguiente, por favor.
continued to make these
Finalmente,
available
nosotros
to
tenemos hoy
improve
unos
our customer
inspectores en las
service
diferentes
efforts.
regiones
We do
del
have a
país.
number of
Ahí está el
inspectors
mapa,
located in
van a ver
different
ustedes
areas
ahí
of
el
the
mapa
country. You
de
can see
Colombia,
this on the
en donde
slide
hemos
here. We see the map of Colombia.
logrado mantener lo que está en color como verde.
Apologies from the interpretation booth.
Reuniones
The
virtuales
audio
que hemos
is
logrado hacer en las diferentes
intermittent.
regiones, denuncias, esas quejas o digamos de
In
esas
many of these
contingencias como
locations
tal.
that you can
Eso
see,
lo hemos
we've been
logrado
able to
seguir
implement
manteniendo a través
virtual
de
reporting
sesiones virtuales y
systems,
hemos visto
and
que
these systems
se han
allow
aumentado
for
el
the
tipo de sesiones frente a lo que teníamos
submittal of
anteriormente en la entidad.
reports by users
Esto es lo que tiene que ver con
through
los temas de
electronic
atención al
means,
ciudadano
and
y de
much of this has to
prepararnos
do
al interior
with
de la entidad para
customer
volvernos
service
virtuales. Ya en lo
issues,
que tiene que ver con la
and
evaluación
it
de las listas
also
ambientales.
involves
Siguiente diapositiva,
an
por favor.
important
Lo
part of
que
the
hemos
transition
identificado
to
es siempre
digital
nosotros cuando hacemos,
technology
recibimos
for
una
all of our
solicitud de una licencia,
procedures. Now, whenever
hacíamos
we
una
get an
visita a
application
la
for a
zona del
license,
terreno.
traditionally we would
Entonces, en este caso, lo
conduct
que
an
hemos es
on-site
definido un
inspection
protocolo de
of
cuándo
the
sí y
location,
cuándo
but
no se
given the
requiere
current situation,
realizar una
we've
visita.
developed
Y para
a
eso tenemos
protocol
diferentes
that
consideraciones.
allows
Les
us
hemos ido
to
recientemente
ascertain
a la región, si la
whether or not
conocemos,
an
si hay proyectos
in-person
cercanos
intervention
donde
is
hagamos
required,
información,
depending on
digamos, de
the
monitoreo,
location,
lo
the
que hablaba
available
también
monitoring
Tessy,
resources
digamos, de esa
in the
fiscalización a
area,
través de redes de
and whether
monitoreo.
or
Si
not
tenemos esa
any
información,
enforcement effort can
podríamos
be
considerar
conducted
no
through
tener una
different
visita de red,
virtual
para la cual estamos proponiendo
means.
visitas
And in those
virtuales
cases,
guiadas. Y es
we
donde se
then
utilizarían la disponibilidad,
decide
digamos,
that an
de imágenes
in-person
satelitales
intervention is not
recientes.
required, and we
También,
rely
digamos, una
on the
visita
use
previa a
of
lo que les mencionaba,
satellite
proyectos
imagery,
cercanos como tal, la utilización de
and we
drones
also
en la
consider
zona o
nearby
sobrevuelos
projects,
tripulados o no tripulados,
general area
recorridos, digamos, a través de
characteristics.
tracks por GPS como
We also
tal.
use
Y
GPS
definitivamente lo que
technology
sí
and other
y que le
geolocation technology.
entendíamos a Christopher, y es como la visión
And
de la
as I was
participación
mentioning to
ciudadana y
Christopher,
de los
this is
mecanismos de
a
participación.
vision
Es
that
un
we
tema que
have
estamos
for
viendo cómo se
citizen
hace a través de
participation,
videollamadas,
and
teléfonos,
the
en
way
otras
that we are
redes.
now
Entonces, digamos, esto es
adopting
lo que
new
hemos
reporting
propuesto para los
methods through the
ejercicios
use of other
de evaluación de
technologies
licencias
other than
ambientales.
in-person
Siguiente, por favor. En lo
mechanisms.
que tiene que ver con el seguimiento,
Now, in terms of
y
follow-up,
digamos, para ponerlo en orden de magnitud, nosotros hoy hacemos control y
and just
seguimiento a
to
cerca de
place this in order of
3.300
magnitude,
expedientes, y lo cual hemos
we
identificado, y
used to
frente a
average
la pregunta,
approximately
una de las dos preguntas que hacíamos al
3,300
inicio
environmental
del
compliance
conversatorio,
files.
la entidad en términos generales va dependiendo de la fase del proyecto en que
And
esté.
in
Si está en
general
construcción,
terms,
vamos 2 veces al
our
año. Si está en
organization, depending
operación, vamos
on
una
the
vez al año.
phase of a
Para cubrir
project,
estos
we
3.300,
will
entonces lo
visit
que
the
definimos
site
fue
perhaps
hacer
once
como unas
or
listas
twice
de
per year.
chequeo
And so
internas
we were
que
able to create
denominamos
these
también
internal
como una
checklists
verificación preliminar
that we
de lo que nos entregan
used
en los
as
informes o en los
preliminary
reportes anuales o
verification
semestrales.
that
Entonces ya
supplements
estamos
some of
haciendo ese
these
ejercicio
annual
y
and
eso lo que hace es que de
6
esos
months reports.
3.300 le estamos haciendo
So
ese ejercicio a 2.800 y hemos
this allowed
definido
us
que
to reduce this
1.365 le
3,300
vamos a hacer un seguimiento
to
espacial. Ese
2,800,
seguimiento
and in
espacial es el
much of
contraste con
these
imágenes
following
satelitales de alta precisión,
stages, we
con
were
los
able to
cuales podemos
provide
hacer
follow-up
análisis
activities
multitemporales,
through
porque estamos
spatial
tomando
follow-up.
foto
We
diaria.
also
Bueno,
conducted
nosotros no estamos tomando
document
fotos, sino
follow-up,
que hicimos
and we
una
use
compra de ese
technology
servicio de que
to
nos toma fotos
collect
diarias de los diferentes proyectos para hacer, digamos,
satellite
ese
imagery
comparativo
that
multitemporal.
relates to
Y
different
lo que hemos
projects, and this
definido
allows
es
us
que
to
se le
conduct
suma ese
comparative
análisis
analysis to
multitemporal a
see
unos proyectos en donde
how
hemos definido que
compliance
puedan
is
ser críticos,
behaving
que
in
tienen
all
unas
of these
consideraciones
locations. We also
especiales
set
por temas
aside some
de
of these critical elements or
agua,
special
aire, suelo,
items that
conflictividad
merit
socioeconómica o transformación
additional
de conflictos en
attention,
el territorio,
including
y le
any
estamos
air,
haciendo ese
soil,
seguimiento a
quality
800,
issues,
pero
as well
todo
as
esto
compliance
es
issues.
desde como tal. Por eso es
But all of
importante
this can be
fortalecer
done
todos los
from our
procesos
headquarters in Bogota
virtuales de la entidad
through the
para poder
various
hacer estos
location
ejercicios. Y
offices that we
finalmente,
have that
lo que sí hemos
employ some of
visto de
these
esos
virtual tools and
3.300
platforms, as well
proyectos,
as
hay
other
125 que en
technologies.
términos
And
generales están en construcción
from these
y son a los cuales les vamos a hacer esas
3,300 projects, we've seen that
guiadas de las cuales estamos
125 or
hablando con
125
anterioridad.
of them are
Siguiente,
in
por
the
favor.
construction phase and are the
En
ones
lo
that
que
are
tiene que
subject
ver
to
con ese
in-person
proceso
visits.
que hablábamos ahorita del seguimiento
Now,
documental
getting back
espacial
to this
y lo que estamos
spatial
viendo, digamos, de proyectos
document
como de tecnología,
virtual
pero también
process related
geotecnológicos,
to
como los hemos llamado,
these
lo que nos
follow-up
permite es identificar
mechanisms.
posibles infracciones
We've
ambientales,
also
que nos
analyzed
permite también ser mucho
geological
más
and
oportunos
other
porque tenemos
factors as well as environmental
prácticamente la
factors, and these
fotografía
are
aérea,
timely
lo que hacemos
because
es
we
una altura de
have
mapas, un cruce
satellite
con unas
imagery, which
zonificaciones que
provides us
nosotros
with
definimos y vamos viendo
mapping
si se está
algebra,
comportando de acuerdo a la
and this
decisión
is
que
something that we
le,
can
le
tailor
decimos.
in
Y
accordance with our
según lo
needs
que
to be able to
observemos en
conduct the
esos dos
monitoring
primeros
process.
aspectos, pues definimos los dos siguientes, y
And
es
we can
esas visitas guiadas a través de los
identify
tracks de
a
GPS que
number of
mencionábamos y poder
factors.
realizar
First and
esas
foremost,
visitas
we can
en
detect
campo
possible
como tal,
environmental
nuevamente, como lo
violations
definíamos, guiado. Siguiente, por
and
favor.
document this, and
Y
we
lo que
can also
hablábamos del
provide
seguimiento
follow-up
documental
for
espacial,
100% of these
este
cases.
se utiliza para
And when we
contrastar y
talk
validar la
again about
información
this follow-up
geográfica
measure,
con la línea base que nos
we
entregaron
conduct
en la evaluación
documentary
del proceso
follow-up
del estudio
using spatial information, and
de,
this
de,
is
de la solicitud de la
used
licencia
to
ambiental. Y
contrast
este
and
seguimiento
validate
documental
the
espacial,
geographical
digamos, es un
information
complemento, lo hemos
that we
visto como un
collect,
complemento
and this
para el ejercicio del
serves as a
seguimiento como tal.
complement or supplement to
Esto
the
nos ha permitido,
follow-up
digamos,
exercise
enfocar
as
en
such.
algunos aspectos
So
bien
we've been able
importantes
to
y,
focus
como
on
también lo
very
decía
important
Tessie,
factors.
es un tema que nos
And
ayuda,
as
digamos, a
Desi
una
has
actuación
mentioned already,
preventiva,
this
porque
is
empezamos
something
a
that
ver que
allows
se
us
está
to operate in
moviendo
a
hacia
preventive
una
way,
zona los
because we
proyectos
can
en
see
donde
that
no
if
fue
we're starting to
autorizado, pues
see
muy
in certain
rápidamente podemos
areas
tomar esa actuación
projects
como tal.
being undertaken
Entonces
that
esto
were
lo que nos ha
not
permitido es hacer,
previously
digamos, unas
authorized,
actuaciones
then we
a
can then
partir de herramientas
intervene in a more
geográficas y
timely way. So we
satelitales en
can
el
use these
proceso de
satellite
seguimiento
and
ambiental.
mapping
Siguiente,
tools
por
to be
favor.
able to provide
En lo
this
que tiene que ver con
environmental
las
follow-up.
actuaciones
In
sancionatorias,
terms of sanction
digamos,
and
los
other types
códigos,
of
digamos,
actions,
administrativos y
when we talk about
sancionatorios
administrative
ambientales y
code
penales,
and different environmental
nos
sanctions,
han permitido también, digamos, el tema de
these
oralidad.
tools have
Es algo que no
also
está muy
allowed us
considerado en
to
la autoridad, pero ya hemos hecho, digamos,
expand
varios
our
procesos
effort,
en donde utilizamos herramientas
and
como
we
Teams,
are
entre otras,
using
en
different
donde
tools such
utilizamos
as Teams,
reuniones
among others,
virtuales para hacer,
and we
digamos, los
use some of
procesos
these
como tal.
meeting
Entonces,
platforms
eso nos ha
to be able to
permitido,
provide follow-up
primero, no interrumpir los
procedures
términos de
and
los,
actions
de los
to some of these
procesos,
processes.
de los procedimientos como
So as a
tal. Hemos
result of
realizado,
this
como les
use of these
mencionábamos, esas
platforms, we
audiencias
haven't had any
virtuales, que ha sido
delays in these
novedoso, digamos, en
activities.
este ejercicio. Hemos
And
tomado,
this has
digamos,
been
decisiones de
a
fondo
very
que incluyen,
novel
digamos,
approach
medidas
for us
preventivas. En algunos
because
casos,
it's very
hemos
helpful,
parado algunos
especially
proyectos
in
como
terms
resultado,
of
digamos, del
preventive measures.
incumplimiento a
We've been
través,
able
digamos, de
to
esas audiencias
stop
virtuales, y
many
nos ha
of these
permitido continuar también
unauthorized
el
projects,
impulso
given that we've been able
procesal
to
de
intervene
todas
in a much
estas
more timely way through the
actuaciones
use of these
sancionatorias.
technologies and tools.
Y eso es lo
And
que
this
nos ha
has
llevado,
allowed
digamos,
us to
nuevamente es a fortalecer, que sería
impose
el
some
tema quinto,
sanctions on
a
some
fortalecer todos los
unauthorized
procesos y las
activities.
plataformas
So
al interior
part
de la
of our
entidad
mandate
para que
is
nos
to
permita,
expand
al
and
final,
strengthen all of
digamos, esa
our
interacción
agency
virtual con las entidades
platforms,
de
and we
control
will be
para
able
efectos de
to
ir mostrando
expand
que
this
hemos seguido continuando
virtual
el ejercicio de
access
autoridad
tools
como tal. Y
that are
finalmente, nos ha tocado
indispensable for
hacer,
our
digamos,
monitoring
diferentes
efforts.
procesos de capacitación en el
Additionally,
marco de la entidad
we've been able
para
to
efectos de
provide
demostrar que,
different
digamos, que
types of
todos estos
training
procesos de
to be able to
capacitación,
demonstrate that
todos
all
estos
of
procesos
these
sancionatorios se pueden hacer en esa
processes
propuesta.
that
Siguiente,
involve
y muchas gracias.
sanctions can be conducted in a non-in-person way. Thank you very much. That's all I had. Thank you, Rodrigo, for your presentation. And thank you for discussing issues that are so important, such as the internal measures that you undertook to protect your staff and personnel, the measures that you undertook to address some of these customer service issues. And thank you for elaborating a little bit more on these platforms and other mechanisms such as telephonic systems, as well as other technologies that you are now employing in your impact assessment work, as well as the follow-up mechanisms that you are providing for licensing purposes. Now, continuing on with the structure of the webinar, I'd like to welcome Stephen Collins. He's a sector leader for the Environmental Social Solutions Unit at the Inter-American Development Bank. Stephen is an environmental specialist with more than 25 years of experience working for different
consultoría e instituciones financieras.
consulting firms, as well as other environmental institutions that focus on sustainable development. Stephen's project management experience has taken him all over the world, including the US, Latin America, Europe, Africa, Asia, and the Middle East. He has a degree in evolutionary ecology and a master's degree in environmental policy. Stephen, you have the floor.
To be reminded of those wonderful travels, considering my travels nowadays are limited to my mailbox in the grocery store. To everybody else, good morning. Thank you very much for this opportunity to present. I hope everybody is safe at home with their families and maintaining levels of sanity during this crisis here. Hopefully, as a global society, we'll move out of it and learn from it. So today I wanted to, I'm sharing my screen with you now, slowly. We wanted to present what the IDB is doing moving forward under these new circumstances that we are all living under here. And I wanted to provide a little bit of context as to explain what we're doing in this scale. So my unit, the Environmental and Social Solutions Unit within the IDB, supports every year between 70 and 100 Category A and Category B projects in preparation. This year, we are supporting about 260 high and substantial risk projects in execution. The bank itself has another 450 to 500 projects or so that are supervised outside of my unit. And obviously, we work with all of our 26 borrower countries in the region in doing capacity building workshops and doing internal capacity building workshops within the IDB itself. And of course, this year, we are looking at doing that pretty much virtually throughout the entire year. And if things go well, we'll be able to shift back to presential presentations and site visits. But as of right now, we have to plan everything in a virtual context. So overall context here is things from a policy perspective have not changed. So while everything is different in what we're doing, all of our projects in preparation still require EAs and ESIAs or CESAs or sociocultural assessments. They require environmental and social management plans. All of the environmental licenses still apply. They still have to do public consultation. Resettlement plans, restoration plans are all required if they need to be done. None of that has changed. And of course, doing it from a virtual platform complicates things. And the one thing we know is necessary to move forward is we need to maintain even closer communication with all of our executing agencies, the engineers and the project planners, our various consultancies that are working on these projects, and as well as IDB internal. We have offices all over the region, and so sometimes it's difficult to be in close contact, and we really need to keep that in perspective and work together to be successful in implementing all of this. Projects in execution, we have 260 projects, as I said, that are moving forward in every sector in the bank. So, you know, all of these have all their plans are in executions, the licenses have been issued, and there are requirements that must be met. Ongoing community engagement is very important, and again, all during social distancing. Management of grievance mechanisms has never been more important. In times where we cannot visit our project sites, and in most cases our executing agencies cannot visit our project sites, a robust grievance mechanism is very important because the people living there are still being affected by these projects, and they generally have mechanisms to send their complaints and their concerns and their doubts. And we can still, as agencies, deal with them remotely. And of course, management of active construction sites is complex given COVID. If there are workers working together, sometimes in confined spaces, we really need to make sure we are protecting the health and safety of those workers, and also the health and safety of our communities where these work sites are going on. We have projects, you know, in the middle of downtown areas, urban projects, but also very rural projects where, above all, we need to make sure the health and safety of the workers and the communities that we're working in is maintained. And again, all without the benefit of physical presence. So our overall strategy and what we've been working on as a unit and a bank is increase frequency of virtual meetings. I'm sure like this Zoom meeting, you guys are all a bit tired of attending Zoom meetings and Microsoft Team meetings and various different virtual platforms, but I beg you don't stop. They're extremely important to maintain this communication, and we need to work together to have a robust strategy to deal with this. We also like to see an enhanced focus on these semi-annual reports. So all of our projects send semi-annual reports, if not more frequent, and we want to see a little bit more detail in those, and that way we can have a little bit better understanding of what's occurring on the site without actually being at the site. Now, considering we cannot visit the site, we have a greater dependence on desktop reviews and existing databases, particularly in preparation of projects when we need to do EAs. That information can be very useful, and we have to be very careful. Normally we use that information anyways, but we send people into the field to verify it. And under these circumstances, we can't really send people, but we do have some technological solutions I'll discuss later that we can use to help us move forward. Something else that can be very useful also is expanded utilization of local consultants. Being based in DC and working in 26 countries, we have various barriers to our travel where, you know, it might be fine for me to leave DC, but it might not be fine for me to arrive in Buenos Aires, for example. However, it might be okay for local consultants to travel from one city to another. And as long as it doesn't create a health situation, we can use local consultants to take a look at our sites for us. Obviously, virtual consultations is what we focused on early so that we could keep projects moving. And we want to see that now shift to a virtual ongoing community engagement, particularly as we don't know how long this situation is going to last. We want to keep our projects moving, and obviously a crisis like this doesn't stop the need for roads to be built, for agricultural development to occur, etc. But we need to keep our communities involved, and again, ongoing community engagement and grievance mechanisms are extremely important in these times to help people understand what's going on and keep them informed of our project movements. Grievance mechanisms now aren't what they used to be. It's not a phone number that you can call anymore necessarily. It's tech enabled. People can send complaints with photos, you know, from their iPhone. That works great in areas, obviously, urban areas or other areas where you have good internet connections. And we want to see our grievance mechanisms being built a little stronger to include this option. Stakeholder and community participation has also shifted a bit. Obviously, we aren't doing presential meetings, we're doing everything online. And we have seen great success with some of our executing agencies putting things on Facebook Live, also creating enormously large WhatsApp groups and you know, moving forward with community engagement through those platforms, which are actually quite common. Most people know them, most people have access to them. And another thing we have done within the unit is we have prepared a number of new guidance notes in order to help people understand what they need to do from a health and safety perspective, as well as to help guide on virtual consultations. How can they be done in a virtual platform and still not lose the quality and the content that we expect to have in a public consultation? We have also prepared a number of strategic and environmental and social assessments that are ready to go for projects that we know are moving forward, and we want them to move forward quickly without waiting 8 weeks or 12 weeks for an environmental assessment to be done. So these pre-cooked strategic environmental and social assessments, if you will, satisfy our requirements for an environmental assessment that can be published in order for a project to move forward without causing a wait period and delaying a project. Finally, a bunch of technical solutions we're looking at, which I'll move to now. We have a number of things that we've been using, and most of them are not new. They've been in existence. We're just using them more now. One very simple thing is Google Street View. The map on the left shows where it is very useful as coverage is high, and as you can see, most of the Latin America region and Caribbean has very good coverage. So this is a very useful tool that we can use. and it gives you, recent street views of what's going on the street or in the location, and it can really help you understand what the actual situation is without actually setting foot on the ground. Satellite imagery is extremely powerful, and this you can get from a number of things. Obviously, most of you already have Google Earth, which is extremely useful, and you can get simple images and see the difference over time. Every image will tell you what the date it was taken on, and you can see things like new buildings being built, new roads opening up, other land disturbances and land use changes. And then there's also more data inclusive imagery available through numerous space agencies like the Japanese Aerospace Exploration Agency. European Space Agency has an incredible amount of data. Their satellites cover the globe every 6 days. So using their data, you can get fresh information every week. NASA's out there. Terra Cigna is a company we signed an MOU with specifically to crunch the data. Some of the data you see or you don't actually see in these satellite images can be very powerful. So the image on the left, unfortunately you can't read what it means, but we did a detailed study in the area around Lake Titicaca. And what we looked at was a number of things, but some of the information most powerful was the land use change. So this map is all about land use change, and it showed a massive amount of urban expansion and agricultural expansion, as well as a significant amount of degradation of natural areas and vegetation. This map also shows, but it's almost non-existent, areas of expanded vegetation. And this showed us that about 10% of the total land area outside of El Alto and La Paz had changed and had been more disturbed than it was before. But you can get a lot more data than what you see in the pictures. And also in this study, we looked at water quality. We looked at air quality. And the water quality really helped us identify, in particular, 2 rivers that were the primary sources of pollution to Lake Titicaca. But we also looked at things like precipitation, which we saw was down 23% over the last 20 years. We looked at temperature, and that's up almost 6% over the last 20 years. We looked at bofedales, which are high altitude wetlands, a very sensitive environment, very important both from an environmental perspective and a social perspective as locals use them heavily. And those were all decreasing at rates of 6%, 7%, 10% in some areas. We looked at snowpack and, the glaciers, and a lot of this stuff is climate change related. And snowpack was decreasing at rates of 5, 6, 10% in these areas. And so tools like this can go beyond projects. It can also help governments prioritize projects. Obviously, when you see data like this, it should shift your priority to water. These areas are very important for both the water supply of Pause, but also for the agriculture and the country in general. So it can really help you focus what you need to do and even help define policy when you see data like this. Finally, there are other technological solutions. ArcGIS, there are a number of different platforms you can use, and these can also be linked to your grievance mechanism, where you can open these up to as many people as you want. If you want to keep it within your executing agency, within your ministry, within the government in general, or open it up to the public, you can do this. And it can include a lot of different data on what's happening on your projects. And again, it can be useful to include the community in this, both so that they are informed and that they can inform you of what they see happening on the project, particularly in times where we cannot go visit them ourselves. Other technological solutions we are using are quite simple. Aerial photos and videos. Drones, of course, are extremely useful. We have a platform we've been using in the bank called Infradinamica, which is extremely useful. It uses drones. It can also use, and anyone can contribute to this. Again, whoever you open it up to can provide whatever data you need to gather from your projects. Drones are being used now to deliver medical supplies to rural areas. And this is extremely important when we cannot travel to these rural areas, and yet COVID is spreading through Latin America still. We need to be able to get medical supplies to remote places fast and quickly. And then, of course, remote sensing is extremely useful. In drones, there are numerous types of drones you can use. If you're working on a port project, there's aquatic drones that you can do mapping of the ocean floor or river floors. And obviously, we saw in an earlier presentation, you can program your drones to cover whatever area you want and fly whatever pattern you want. And again, if your projects are in construction, you can generally have a drone there and a pilot for the drone that can easily take videos every single day, photos every single day, to give you more information on a daily basis without actually visiting the site. And again, webcams, GoPros, smartphones, a lot of these things. We've had some projects in very remote areas where we're trying to schedule virtual consultations, but most people do not even have cell phones. And so they've actually asked us as part of the project funds to buy some cell phones that can be used in the communities, and we can use them. And cell phones are extremely popular. Even very remote indigenous communities quite often have access to smartphones, which allow virtual access to work sites when we can't actually go there. For us, when we do supervision missions, if there's an environmental and social counterpart at the site, we can use them to do a walkthrough with us. They can use their iPhone if they want and put on the video, and we can direct them where they need to go. We know the problem sites. We know the areas we want to see. We know the action plan items that should be being worked on in the areas. So we can do a walk around and get almost the same information we get with us being physically there. And again, that allows us to really visit focus areas, and it also promotes community involvement. That's all. I think I made it within my time period. Thank you very much.
Gracias a ti, Steven. Lo hiciste.
Thank you, Stephen. You were right on time, and so thank you very much for that. Some of the points that you made were really important. That one of the main ideas was that the requirements for the projects haven't changed, but rather how we go about meeting them. Also, compliance expectations haven't changed either, and it needs to be addressed. You also talked about the general strategies that the IDB is using, like some of the reports and the use of databases and remote consultation, which is something that we brought up at the last webinar. Also, greater community engagement through different platforms like Facebook and WhatsApp, how to address things through grievance mechanisms, and also the use of technical solutions. For example, Google Street Views and satellite imagery, NASA and the ESA, and the Japanese agency, Terra Signa, and others for specific interventions. For example, looking at a specific ecosystem. You also mentioned other technological solutions like drones, webcams, and GoPros, and cell phones, which you mentioned towards the end. So thank you very much for this presentation. And now, before I turn to Erica Kensler, I would like to once again remind everyone who is with us for this webinar that you can share your questions through the chat. We've seen a lot of activity on the chat. We've gotten a lot of questions already. And so we ask that you keep at it and that you keep using this tool. Now we have, last but not least, our fourth panelist, Erica Kensler, who is the director of the National Enforcement and Investigation Center, the NEIC, at the Environmental Protection Agency of the United States. Erica?
I am having technical difficulties right now. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm trying to get the screen share to work, and it was working, and then I see it dropped off, so.
Erica, I'm just introducing you, so please, the tech group can help Erica to get her presentation on, please. While they're trying to fix it, I'm finishing your introduction. Is that okay with you?
Erica, this is Davis. If you would like, I can show your slides while you speak. We may have lost her.
Ya. Vamos a esperar brevemente mientras
So
Erika
let's see if we can take a few moments and wait for Erica to join us again. Perhaps we can give her a minute to make the necessary adjustments.
So I'm back on. Can somebody else share my PowerPoint and we'll just have to make that work because I don't know what's happening here.
No worries, Erika. Davis, do you have her presentation?
Yes, I will share that.
Thanks,
So
David.
while Davis is, mientras Davis está haciéndola presentando, quiero terminar
Sure,
la
also,
introducción.
if I can just finish the introduction while Davis gets set up. Now, before being at the NEIC, Erica worked in the Emergency Management Office in 2016, where she was head of the assessment unit for clinical, biological, and radiological emergencies. And before joining that office, Erica joined the EPA in 2004. Erica has a master's in governance and national security, focusing on biodefense at the Johns Hopkins University, and a degree from Lafayette College in political science, and also a degree from the University of North Carolina. Erica, you have the cyber floor, and Davis will be helping with the presentation.
Thank you very much. So I'm here to talk to you today about a mobile platform that we have been utilizing during COVID. We use it outside of COVID, but we have found this to be one of our best technologies to aid in still ensuring compliance during these challenging times. So this is called the Geospatial Measurement of Air Pollution. We call it GMAP for short, and for the rest of the presentation, that is how I will refer to it. It is a mobile advanced air monitoring vehicle, and we've been using it on multiple campaigns to evaluate large geographic areas in very short timeframes in order to identify emission sources. It's been used to support strategic planning from a national perspective, perform sampling and analysis to support our compliance investigations, and it's a powerful screening tool for facilities or locations that have elevated emission sources. We've recently used it to survey more than 200 facilities. We did this in 6 days. This allowed local regulators to issue 65 immediate findings. It also contributed to a study of benzene emission sources, which led to a $2.5 million settlement payment to the state of Texas. Next slide, please. This is a picture. I'll wait for this slide. Sorry. Uh-oh.
I think I need to change it.
While we are pulling up the slides, I can say that one of the things that's really nice about this is we can do compliance from a distance so our staff are not endangered. Oh, there we go. So that is a picture of our current vehicle. It's a converted van that we have modified to install multiple instruments that include analyzers, a GPS system, and a weather station for wind speed and direction, temperature, and pressure. Next slide, please. So an overview of what you see in the vehicle. I did mention it's a mobile platform. It can analyze for methane, BTEX, total volatile organic compounds, hydrogen sulfide, and we can use the GPS to track the location and the wind speed to identify the specific source. Now, I could spend time on all the technical specifications of exactly what kind of equipment we use to do that. But in the interest of time, just know that's available should you have further interest. Next slide, please. So what you see here is a visual representation of the data at a tank terminal. So all of the white circles on the screen are actual tanks, and the white lines are actually arrows that are indicating the wind direction. The red elevated readings, that indicates elevated VOC concentrations. The green area is the background, what's natural background in the environment. and the yellow area is what is in between. And so what you can see from this picture is if we had mapped the lower portion of the facility, we would have thought that it was the tanks that were emitting the elevated readings. However, because we were able to drive a vehicle and map the entire facility, we identified a large source of elevated VOCs coming from the rail car unloading station that is in your upper to middle portion of the map. This is the height of the red bar, indicates the severity of the VOC emissions. So in other words, using this tool, we saved a lot of time and manpower, and we're able to zero in on precisely the location of the emissions issue. Next slide, please. This is just another visual representation of what we were able to do using the vehicle. These are two stationary measurements that can be seen at the facility using some polar plots. This illustrates both the direction to the source and the relative concentration of emissions. The colors indicate the benzene concentration being captured, and the shapes indicate the wind direction and speed. So using data like this, our inspectors are able to determine what equipment precisely is releasing the emissions, and again, save time and do it all from a safe distance. Next slide, please. So one of the things that we have done during COVID, for the most part, our staff have been working from home, and we have mostly stopped doing inspections unless there is a critical threat to public health or the environment. However, with the use of this GMAP vehicle, we have gotten several requests to continue working because we can stay so remote. So one we just completed is in the United Basin in Utah. This is a non-attainment area for ozone, and it's a very high priority for our agency. We were asked to identify emissions at oil and gas operations between April and May, just a few weeks back, and we were able to perform this mobile monitoring, and we collected 27 stationary measurements and obtained air canisters. And if you go to the next slide, I can show you a map of what the area looks like. So you can see it's a large oil basin in northeastern Utah, and there's a tremendous amount of oil and gas development that's led to significant environmental issues regarding air quality, water quality, and the management of drilling wastes. Next slide, please. So one of our concerns with COVID is how do we safely conduct inspections like this and keep our staff safe? And so what we've done here, we actually have an RV, a recreational vehicle that is parked in front of the GMAP. And so the staff members that volunteered, they went into isolation for 2 weeks prior to deploying, and then they camped in the RV. So they did not use hotels, they did not go to restaurants. They brought all of their own food, and they used the kitchen in the vehicle, and they slept in the vehicle, and they drove around a very remote part of Utah for 12 days. So what they were able to do in that 12 days is hit 27 stationary measurements and collect 5 air canisters. But they were able to safely complete this without having any human interaction that could potentially expose them to the virus. Next slide. And so this is just an example of them collecting the stationary measurements. They pull up near an oil and gas well, and they are able to park the vehicle and collect the data, again, remotely without having to enter a facility. And if, in doing this, they were able to identify high levels of elevated methane, benzene, and VOCs. Next slide. So this next slide, this is an example. This is exactly what they mapped when they were in Utah a few weeks back. And again, just as a reminder, the white arrows are the wind direction, and the red is the elevated readings. The green is background. And the red bars show that there's very high VOCs in the area. And based on the wind direction, it can be assumed that the source of emissions is the well site that is right to the right of the green line. And I'm pointing to it, realizing you can't see me doing that. So I share this with you today because it's a great example, I think, of attempts we've been making to be a little more innovative in how we go about conducting and ensuring compliance during the COVID virus. This is always a tool we had, but we never thought about using it as much as we are now, and especially pairing it with a recreational vehicle where the staff are willing to camp. Obviously, that does take certain types of staff that are willing to camp and not stay in a hotel, but I'm sure our teams are all very similar in that they have a passion for protecting the environment and will do what it takes. So this is this is the tool we've been employing. And if anyone is interested in further details, the last slide has a point of contact that can provide all the technical specifications of what we built. Because again, this is a van that anybody can access. It's just a matter of adding the right sensors and monitors to the van. So let me stop there. In the interest of time, I believe we want to leave some time for questions and answers, but thank you very much for your attention today.
Muchas gracias, Erika.
Thank you very much, Erica, for your fascinating presentation related to your geospatial platform that can measure air quality parameters in specific locations. And I was fascinated by the example that you discussed related to the Uinta Basin in Utah and the various challenges that this type of work poses for your personnel. And this includes the use of camping equipment or vehicles to ensure that no exposure is present for your employees in the face of the pandemic, and that the work can be carried out using these devices and innovative measures. Now, we have many questions, and we only have 30 minutes to address these questions. And so in the interest of time, I'd like to pose a question to each one of our speakers. And I'd like the speakers to be as concise and as succinct as possible to save the maximum amount of time possible and address as many questions as possible. So in order in which they were submitted, I have a question for Tessie. And the first question is, the automated equipment is made up of what type of equipment, as well as the mobile units, and what type of parameters do you monitor? Thank you for your question. We have different stations that are located within mobile units that can be moved from one place to another, but some equipment is placed permanently in different strategic areas. We primarily look at microparticle measurements, PM10, PM5, which is of interest for us because we have air quality standards that need to be in compliance with regard to, as I stated, the air quality. So the various levels that we observed in the environment are documented by these different types of equipment. We also have an alert system that provides us with alerts in those cases where we see the maximum allowable level for any of these types of particle matter. So once we see these thresholds being reached, we then inform our supervision and our authorities. We also inform any key stakeholders that may be involved in the location. And we try to also associate this level of particulate matter with any particular activity that may be taking place in a certain location. So once we identify the source of these contaminants, then we try to contact the operator of the facility, whatever it may be, to inform them that they are out of compliance, and then we provide follow-up to ensure that the situation was resolved. In any case, when we start using these sensors that relate to water quality, we're primarily interested in identifying large quantities of metals. Now, in some cases, we may not be able to source the generator of the contamination. If we can't pinpoint a particular business or operation, then we have an issue, and we need to try and engage in this effort of identifying the culprit. So we use these sensors and these monitoring systems. And so when we know that it's likely going to be a certain operator or a certain business, then we contact those operators directly. Now, when we have something that's a little bit more vague, we have to undertake this effort to try to identify the source of these contaminants as soon as possible. Thank you very much, Tessie. There's another question here. When we talk about licensing, this is a question for Rodrigo. How can the licensing process be expedited given that it's understood that the COVID-19 pandemic has restricted some action? So what are some of the processes?
Vale, muchas gracias. Digamos que nosotros en términos generales no hemos considerado
in general terms, we haven't really
como necesidad de
seen
modificar la
a
norma
need to
específicamente en lo que tiene que
modify
ver
the
con la
standards that we use for the
agilización de las licencias
licensing
ambientales.
procedure,
Lo que sí hemos
especially
hecho es establecer
in
una
terms of
serie
making
de
it more
procedimientos
expeditious.
que nos
What
permitirían
we have is a series of
en el término, digamos,
procedures
de lo
that
que es la
allow us to
evaluación
issue these
ambiental,
licenses
lo que
in the
planteábamos ahorita,
shortest amount
o
of
sea,
possible.
hay como
When
unas
we talk about
consideraciones
environmental
especiales aquí
assessments,
en Colombia, y
we
es
have to
lo que son
consider
audiencias
certain
públicas
specifications
ambientales.
here in
Hemos
Colombia that are
tratado de hacer un
mandatory. When we
ejercicio
talk
de
about public
audiencias públicas
hearings,
no presenciales,
we've tried to
y
convert
actualmente,
from
digamos, los
in-person
jueces
to
no han
virtual
estado como muy de
public
acuerdo que se haga no
consultations.
presencial. En ese
And we've
sentido,
seen some
y cuando
pushback
hablamos de no
from some
presencial,
operators
quiero decir que no
that
es
don't agree
virtual, no nos
with
estamos
the
imaginando que sea por Teams, por
use
Zoom, por
of these
Hangout, sino que volviéramos
virtual
como a lo básico,
meetings
al
through
teléfono,
Zoom
al radio,
or
que
other
pudiéramos tener
platforms.
comunicación en
And so
doble
we've
vía. Eso era
also
lo que era
used
importante.
other
Sin embargo, lo que estamos considerando es que
media,
deberíamos
such as
plantear
radio
como un
stations
tema
and other
combinado, un
types
tema
of
complementario.
technology.
El no presencial,
But
de
over
pronto con
time, we've
presencialidad.
used a
Eso,
combination
digamos, que ha sido todo
of
un
tools and
reto
resources,
actualmente en
and this
Colombia.
has been
Lo siguiente ha sido
particularly
como todos los
challenging
planteamientos
in
de
Colombia.
hacer esas visitas guiadas,
In terms
a
of
través de visitas
conducting
virtuales guiadas. Ese creo que es un
visits,
aspecto
guided visits,
fundamental que permitiría
and
no
using
detener los
remote
procesos. Eso ha sido
platforms, this has been
como
a
lo más
key
importante que hemos buscado desarrollar
undertaking that
como tal.
we've
Y la
engaged
forma de
in and we've
verificar
been
los
developing.
mecanismos de
And the
participación, como
different
las
ways
comunidades,
of
es, digamos, a través de la red de
identifying
nuestros
media to
en la
provide
región,
greater access to communities
poder,
so that we can conduct these consultations through
hacer
social media and other
llamadas telefónicas
platforms.
y saber si se
And these
reunieron,
include
no se
telephone
reunieron, si fue
systems,
debida al
and
marco de
we
lo
can
planteaban
see
los documentos de salvaguarda como
during the
tal.
follow-up
Sin
whether
embargo,
people
sí se ha
had
visto un
access
impacto en
or
algunos
not to
proyectos
some
que
of these
sean nuevos,
consultations.
en donde no conocemos el
And we
área,
have seen some
y
of these
por
newer
consiguiente estamos
projects
considerando
that have
volver a
made an
campo cuando
impact,
ya la
and we're
condición
considering in
del
some of these
confinamiento
cases to
sea
go back
diferente
to
a lo
the
que
field
estamos
to
viviendo hoy.
conduct the on-site inspections once the restrictions of the pandemic are loosened. Thank you, Rodrigo.
¿Cómo o cuáles han sido los principales desafíos?
Question for Stephen here. What have been the main challenges that the bank has had in its use of staff and technologies during COVID for these activities?
I think probably the toughest thing, and I saw in some of the question, is that we work in a lot of very remote areas. You know, we have projects that are rural electrification. If you don't have electricity, you don't have internet. We work on projects like Ultima Mia, where we're providing internet access to areas that currently don't have it. Obviously, in those areas, our virtual platforms aren't going to work. So we need to find kind of a hybridized version of what we always used to do. So in some of these areas, we can do a virtual platform much like this in a public consultation or in a community engagement that is recorded. And then one of the nice things about these very rural areas is they're usually very small population sizes. And most of these rural areas have a type of community center. Even indigenous communities usually have a communal palapa where they can go and do things together. And what we can organize is a method of playing this recording to them in small groups. You might have to do it multiple times to keep the groups small and maintain social distancing. But we can use traditional methods like that with a little bit of tweaking in order to still be able to do our consultations. In other areas, we have areas where there is internet access, but the poverty levels are very high. So nobody has a laptop, nobody has a cell phone. Some of the people that do have cell phones aren't internet enabled. The executing agencies are asking us, can we use loan funds to buy cell phones? You know, buy 5 or 10 cell phones that they can use, and, you know, give it to one person, they use it, clean it, give it to another person, they use it, and we can actually use virtual platforms that way. And obviously that's something that requires flexibility in the bank for procurement and whatnot, and things that weren't originally described in the original loan agreement. It's always tough for us to change, but we need to be flexible and allow things like that to occur.
Muchas gracias, Steven. Ahora, una pregunta para Erika, muy concreta.
Thank you, Stephen. I have a very specific question for Erica now. And this is that the funds that you use for the monitoring in Utah, are those fully provided by the EPA? And a question linked to that one: when you have high emissions, what decisions has the EPA made regarding that situation?
Sure, thank you very much. Yes, we are funded to support the entire country when requested using the GMAP, so we do not charge the states, but we have one vehicle only for the entire United States, so we do have to be selective about where we choose to utilize it. Utah is, as most of you probably know, of course, is right next to Colorado, so during COVID, that one is an easy location for us to get to. Just as an example, we turned down a request to drive to the East Coast and do New Jersey and New York. One, because that would entail quite a bit, about 25 hours of driving, but also because of the COVID outbreak in New York City, we didn't want to send our staff there even with the camping equipment. So, but in normal times, we would go all over the country. I think I saw one of the questions in the chat. We would also do populated areas. We don't only do remote, we'll go anywhere. As to what do we do when we get elevated readings, each case is specific to the facility. In certain cases, the facilities are eager to work together and cooperatively address those elevated readings. In other cases, we will follow up and send an inspector to the rail yard or whatever the area is that was identified to collect additional evidence. But a lot of times we do find that the facilities are not surprised that they had those elevated readings, and they are very willing to take action. But there are those times, of course, where we end up levying heavy penalties on the facility. I think I mentioned in the beginning, there was a facility in Texas that we ended up levying penalties of a few million US dollars. So it does vary, but we have 10 regional offices in the US EPA. And so we work with the regional offices for whatever the location is in their area, and they would pursue it from there once we hand over the data. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias, Erika. Hay varias preguntas más, así que voy a dar una vuelta ahora.
Thank you very much, Erica. There are a few more questions, and so I'll come back around. This is another question for Tessie. So colleagues from Peru are asking Tessie to elaborate more on whether they can find all of the different entities that they oversee, or if there are some categories for who they can find and who they can't. Well, I would say that in the assessment that we're making, we have split groups into two: the large and medium and businesses, where they have 6 months to pay their fines. Those are for all of those of us, for all of those who are in our jurisdiction. And for micro and small businesses, there is a moratorium through June 2021. And so that is what we believe it's going to take for the recovery to start kicking in. Now, if I may, I also wanted to add to one of the other questions that had to do with fines and when there are payment suspensions, and whether these can be deterrents or incentives for environmental protection. I think that's a valid question. Now, I would say that we have different universes or groups for those that we oversee. So in the micro and small business space, that business completely stopped. Hydrocarbon as well. A lot of players saw a full freeze of their operations. And this has to do also with the oil prices. We can still find all of those who oversee, but what we have done is create different scheduling for when we collect payments for those fines. Now, when there is a regulatory component here, where, for example, under regulation, specific business is fully frozen because there is some sort of enforcement activity going on, we have the ability to continue to carry out our activities, even though there are changes in who can conduct business in this time. When a company does not comply with orders that we have issued, we can also step in and fine those players. And so fining could perhaps be a second component that comes in later after we determine that an activity needs to stop so that we can enforce or oversee what is happening. And so there are specific steps and orders that we give out given what we see on the ground. And we also have specific kinds of fines that can have fees attached to it if the situation goes uncorrected. And so I would say that this time has not really affected the way in which we conduct our enforcement and also issue fines to ensure that there is compliance. Thank you, Tessie. Thank you for clearing that up on the second point as well. A question for Rodrigo. It's a very specific question as well. And so I'm assuming it comes from your countrymen and women. It starts with a thought and then it goes into the question. That is that this pandemic is going to be with us for many more months. And so for stakeholders, how can you ensure that they continue to follow up on the licensing processes and participating in these procedures? And can courts still step in when there is something that needs to be addressed?
Sí, perfecto. Digamos que en Colombia ha habido una discusión
I
muy
would say that in
grande
Colombia
sobre
there
lo
was
que
a very broad
significa
conversation on
realizar, digamos,
what
reuniones con grupos de
holding
interés o
meetings
con
with
comunidades o
special
comunidades
interests
étnicas
or
de
ethnic
manera
communities
virtual.
would do and what impact it would have if these were
Esto ha
done
sido un
virtually.
debate muy
The
grande
interpreter points out there are
y
significant
nosotros
losses of audio.
definitivamente lo que hicimos fue como revisar a partir de la entidad nacional de estadística donde había cobertura o no
What we did was
diferentes
try to identify the areas where there was coverage.
medios de comunicación. No solamente lo pensamos en el tema virtual o
And where
de
there was
radio,
connection
pensamos, digamos, diferentes
to different
formas
telecommunication technologies. So not only virtual platforms, but radio and others. Interpreter points out once again that the audio has fully cut out. Interpretation will resume when the audio comes back.
hacer el proceso de no presencialidad. En ese sentido, nosotros ordenamos recientemente una audiencia pública
Interpreter points out that the
presencial,
audio quality is still
y
very
a
poor.
juicio, digamos, de la entidad, entendemos la dificultad y entendemos, digamos, lo que el juez nos planteó. Sin embargo, los resultados fueron increíbles. Es decir, tuvimos en lo que nosotros tenemos unas audiencias informativas, la participación de 1.800 personas. Tuvimos reproducción de cerca de 90.000 veces de los audios que se generaron, más de 200 llamadas durante los procesos de estas audiencias. Entonces, para nosotros, la apuesta de la seguramente habrá que ver cómo mejorarla. Y pues los que estamos metidos en los estudios de impacto son los estudios enormes que según estos procesos son de difícil comprensión, porque es más asertivos en el tipo de lenguaje y sobre lo que queremos presentar. Y ya terminé, Cristian. Estoy viendo varios comentarios que no se oye.
No, parece que tuviste una dificultad en el
Yeah, there
audio.
seem to be some audio glitches. So I think I heard part of your answer.
¿Quieres que repita un poco rápidamente?
Should I quickly repeat what I said? Asked Rodrigo. Christian responds, perhaps
Casi
just
que me
some of
voy a
the
la
main points.
conclusión.
Well,
Y es,
says Rodrigo,
en
I'll just
términos
go
generales,
to
sí, estamos
my
en la
conclusion.
construcción de un protocolo
Yes, we
que
are currently
permita,
developing a
a partir
protocol
de los aprendizajes recientes de
that
estas
helps
audiencias
us
públicas
draw
no
on
presenciales,
these
fortalecer lo que hemos
recent
venido haciendo
virtual
históricamente en el
town
tiempo.
halls and the lessons learned from what we've been doing. Great, thank you. Stephen, this one's for you. And so, big question coming your way. It also starts with a thought. That is that a lot of the tools presented for enforcement and community engagement are used and we've known for a long time. And during this pandemic, of course, we've had to use it. So 3 questions in one. One is, how can you assess the impact while managing the project? 2, how efficient is that monitoring of the projects? And 3, those investment costs, how do they translate into technology used for the projects?
Very well. Sorry, my son just came down and is making monkey noises with a toy. A lot of that hasn't changed with COVID in terms of how we assess it. The difference is how we collect the data. So particularly in project preparation, we are forced to use existing data in many cases, which is not ideal, but it's the only option we have right now. Certain countries, for example, Bolivia and Argentina, no one is leaving their house right now. We cannot, ask anyone to go out and collect data. It would not be wise of the bank, obviously, and it would break local laws. We can't do that. And even when local laws allow it, it might not be wise still. There still might be a dangerous health situation where we would like to have that data, but it's not safe and we're not going to risk human lives to get it. So right now we're being a little flexible and using data that exists. Obviously, in other countries where we can send people out, still we want to field verify that data. But how we process the data is still the same. We still require EAs. We still want to see that, environmental impacts are stated, the social impacts are stated, every environmental and social management plan to address those things. We still want to make sure our executing agencies have the capacity to execute these projects. We still want to make sure there's clauses, and we work on terms of reference. When our executing agencies hire a construction firm to go do this work, they're the ones that are actually creating the impact. It's not IDB, it's not our executing agency, it's that firm. So we want to make sure clauses are in their contracts so that they comply with the ESMP. So in terms of how we do our due diligence, I think I hope I've answered that. The second question was, ¿qué era la segunda?
La eficacia del seguimiento y monitoreo de esos proyectos.
The efficiency of the follow-up and monitoring of these projects, given these new methodologies. And third, how do costs transfer into projects?
The technical solutions to supervise. A number of our projects are still moving forward. Many of them have been stopped for COVID, but a number of them are still moving. We have active construction sites. And generally speaking, when there's an active construction site, there is still an environmental and social representative on site. So we still have communication that we've always had in the past. And for us, in many ways, we have closer communication and a little bit closer look at these sites. Generally, we visit a site once or twice a year. So in terms of what we've lost on some projects, it's nothing yet. We've actually gained because we now have more communication with the people on staff. And like I mentioned earlier, I can have someone on site with their iPhone turn on their camera and walk around, and I can say, show me your waste management area. You know, they can still send me their grievance mechanism table over through emails. And, you know, I can have them walk me to any site on their construction site I want to see what's going on. You know, if they're setting up a webcam, not just the bank, but the executing agency from the capital city can log on and see what's going on that construction site anytime, day or night. So from a supervision perspective, it's obviously not as good when we can't visit the site. It's more than just boots on the ground. It's that personal relationship. It's the camaraderie and working together with our executing agencies and the contractors building it. You build a relationship stronger when you're there with them. So we are missing that. We'll get back to it. But in terms of data and whatnot, we're still getting plenty. Costs. I mentioned this briefly in my little speech. We are trying to be as flexible as possible. Obviously, what's happening now was not foreseen when we did our loan agreements. So we have to be very flexible in terms of procurement. And it makes sense. I mean, you know, sites are not being visited, which means airplane tickets aren't being purchased, hotels aren't being paid for. So in most cases, there's budget there. And we just need to be flexible in saying, okay, you didn't spend $5,000 on flights and hotels and whatnot. Let's use it for something else that will help us have a, you know, better track on this project. And then a lot of the things are actually free. You know, WhatsApp doesn't cost anything as long as people have services. In terms of project scale, it costs next to nothing to buy 10 cell phones if you want to, you know, put 10 cell phones in a small community that people can share. So flexibility is key, and looking at opportunities and innovation and working together with our executing agencies to see what's the best case scenario for each individual project.
Gracias, Steven, por esos datos tan concretos. Y para concluir esta ronda...
Thank you, Steven, for that concrete information. I have a very concrete question for Erica. How fast can the GMAT vehicle move around during its process? And can the vehicle also conduct measurements in urban areas? Unfortunately, Erica had to log off. So we could perhaps send her the question via email at a later time. Thank you, Davis. And just a general question that I will pose to the remaining panelists. And I'd just like you to keep your remarks to 1 minute so we could then close the meeting and discuss future measures. And the question is, given that developing countries don't have budgets to invest in technologies, and given the various challenges faced by different countries, which technologies do you believe to be the most convenient or appropriate to be able to conduct the real-time monitoring and be able to do so with sufficient efficiency to ensure effective operations? Let's go with Tessie, and then, well, undoubtedly strengthening investment in technology for remote enforcement activities. This is something that needs to be already included in the long-term view for prevention purposes. This is key. And being able to have with these tools allows for an expansion of monitoring capability. In many cases, it's almost impossible to access all the details, all of the operations. We have in Peru, for example, operations that are taking place at altitudes of 5,000 meters. So the use of these tools is particularly important in those cases. And so given these restrictions, we need to support ourselves more with technology. At the same time, we need to reconsider the challenge of the work. Perhaps we need to maintain the teleworking model in those particular cases that use these technologies. And this could be even more effective, especially when we compare the model to the in-office scheme that we normally use. And so given that these tools are so effective and that can be used remotely in a very effective way, then we can then reconsider where our personnel needs to be when they use these
Gracias.
methods
Muy
and
en línea con lo
technologies.
que
Thank you.
planteaba Tesi, y digamos,
Well,
para
along
los
the
grandes
lines
proyectos, yo creo que ahí están
of
esas
what
soluciones.
Desi was
Adicionalmente, nosotros
discussing, I
estamos
think that we do
revisando la
have these solutions
utilización
available.
de
We've been looking at the use
monitoreo de bajo costo
of
y que pueda tener la
low-cost
participación
monitoring
de
equipment and
diferentes grupos de interés.
methods,
Entonces, estamos
and
revisando
that
eso
it
como
could
una
involve
alternativa, si
different
bien puede que no
stakeholders, and we're
sean
looking at this as an alternative.
instrumentación aprobada EPA
And it
o
may
Unión
not be
Europea, que no tenga los máximos niveles de certificación,
European
sí nos podría
approved
empezar a dar, digamos, durante
equipment
estos
that's
momentos,
being employed.
digamos, unas
Given
alternativas
the
frente a pasos
current
a seguir
crisis,
y
we
toma
could perhaps
decisiones
then look at
en cuanto
alternative
al
measures
impacto en los recursos
and come up
naturales.
with the
En
necessary
proyectos más
steps that will
pequeños,
allow
lo que
us to
estamos
provide the
considerando es
adequate
modificar algunos
environmental
aspectos de los
impact
reportes y
follow-up.
que se vuelva más
In our
un tema
case,
de autorreporte,
we're trying
no
to
un reporte
transition
sobre el cual
in the
nosotros tengamos
reporting
que
arena to one of
evaluar, sino que sea
self-reporting.
más de autorreporte, generar
We
un poco
would
más de
prefer
confianza
that
entre
the
el
reporting
usuario, el
mechanism
regulado y la
is
autoridad ambiental.
something
Y
that
como lo
involves
mencionó, creo que también
users
Tesi, es que
to a
uno tenga,
greater
digamos,
extent.
unos parámetros sobre los cuales
And we
ve
can
que está
certainly
saliendo de
set up
ciertos
a
rangos, ciertas normas
subset
o
of
ciertos
parameters
procedimientos, uno
that
hace un
need to
ejercicio
be
ya más
considered, and
minucioso de
as
hacer
long
ese
as
seguimiento.
the
Gracias.
users are in full compliance with these parameters and specifications, then we believe that we can get a lot of very valuable information from that. Stephen.
Like what Tessa said, the role of the supervisor in our projects is more important than ever and greatly expanded. We really need to rely upon those services to help us through this. But I think we need to keep everything in perspective here. And it's, you know, the whole COVID situation, we're all in the same storm, but we're not all in the same boat. So obviously we need to look at every project on an individual basis. Not all of our 26 countries have the same capacities. Not every ministry within those countries have the same capacities. And then not each project within whatever ministry is managing the project has the same capacities or availability in terms of technological solutions. So I think part of it is you hope for the best, but you plan for the worst. And each project needs an individual solution, which requires a lot of communication between the IDB and our executing agencies, but also the communities. And I saw one of the questions written earlier was how are communities responding to this expanded role? And I think this is an answer even before COVID is. In my 25-year career, I have never seen a community not want to be involved. And from a bank perspective, we really feel what makes a strong project is strong community support. And the way you get that is by involving them. I think a simple way of thinking about it, especially for government staff, is take yourself out of your government position and put yourself in the position of a person being affected by one of our projects. And how do you want to be involved? Do you want me from my office to say, don't worry, we're going to plan this, you're going to love it, everything's going to be perfect? Or do you want me to come say, we're planning this project and we want you to help us? And then we want you to be involved in the supervision. Tell us what we're doing well. Tell us how we can improve. So I think moving forward, community engagement is crucial. Those people, whether we can get boots on the ground, they're there. They can help us understand what's going on, no matter what our situation is with technology.
Llegando a la parte final.
Thank you, Stephen. We are now getting to the end of our webinar. I'd just like to say that all 4 presentations fell very much in line with the purpose of this webinar. We wanted to discuss how countries are approaching enforcement and licensing processes given the restrictions imposed by the social distancing guidelines. There are a number of questions that we couldn't get to, and we will make available to our panelists at a later time. These presentations will be available. And lastly, I wanted to just remind you that this is just one of a series of webinars. We have other webinars scheduled, and now I'd like to thank everyone for their presentations and their participation, and I yield the floor to Davis.
Thank you, everyone. No, solo agradecer a todos los participantes.
I just wanted to thank all of the participants and presentation formally. I love the diversity and the techniques, or rather the diversity of techniques that are being employed that we heard from. And getting back to Stephen's comments related to the importance of achieving a greater closeness with communities. It's an issue that is more important than it ever has been. So we have to get closer to the communities that are affected, and we need to be more closely involved with the various stakeholders and the people in charge of managing these projects. Once again, I want to thank you all for your participation. Davis, please go ahead and
thank everybody for coming. We will post the presentations to share on the website. I will put that up again. We look forward to having you at our next webinar, the same time. Although planned for 2 hours, these are running late with questions. The next one will focus on enforcement and licensing discretion. Where can you offer flexibility and yet still maintain protection? So any questions, feel free to write me or check the website. Thank you very much, everyone, and look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you, everybody.
Gracias.
Muchas gracias.
a todos. Saludos.